stars stretched endlessly, glittering like diamonds scattered across a vast, inky void. Aboard the imposing command ship of the alien fleet, a general stood at the heart of a massive control room. His kind had ruled the galaxy for centuries, their dominion unchallenged by all but a few scattered rebellions. The general had been forged in the fires of war, his sharp gaze and scarred face evidence of countless victories. But tonight, as he observed the latest reports from the ongoing campaign against the humans, something was different. The humans were not what he had expected. They had been described as weak and disorganized, a species held together by fragile alliances and outdated technology. Yet, what he had witnessed in the field told a very different story. The humans didn't fight for conquest or glory. They fought for each other. Time and again, they stood their ground against impossible odds, not for their survival alone, but to protect the lives of those beside them. The general had seen soldiers carry their wounded through fire, sacrificing their own safety to save a comrade. He had watched as their resolve turned even hopeless battles into victories, or at least into stories of unyielding resistance. The alien fleet had superior firepower, unmatched strategy, and an unbroken record of domination. Yet the humans didn't falter. They adapted. They resisted. And in their eyes, the general saw something that had become foreign to his own kind: hope. For the first time in his long career, he questioned not only the war, but the purpose of his own existence. Reports continued to stream in, glowing holograms casting eerie blue light across the room. A voice crackled over the comms, announcing another skirmish. The general barely listened. His focus was on the faces, human faces, frozen in moments of desperation, triumph, and sacrifice. He remembered one image in particular, captured from a battlefield drone. A human soldier, battered and bleeding, had stood in the wreckage of a devastated city. Behind him were civilians, old, young, injured, huddling in fear. The soldier had raised his weapon and faced down an approaching squad of alien enforcers, outnumbered and outgunned. The courage in his stance was undeniable. The enforcers had advanced, and the feed had cut out moments later. But the general knew how the story had likely ended. The soldier's act of defiance had bought time for the others to escape at the cost of his own life. That image haunted the general, lingering in his mind even as he tried to dismiss it as irrelevant to his duties. He had risen to his rank by embracing the cold logic of war, suppressing personal feelings and doubts. Empathy was a weakness, one that his species had purged long ago in their pursuit of dominance. Yet, as he studied the humans, he began to wonder if they had lost something in that purge, something vital. The general turned away from the console, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache. For years, he had carried out his orders without question. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight of those orders pressing down on him. He had spent his life orchestrating destruction, commanding fleets that reduced entire worlds to ash. But the humans weren't just another species to conquer. They were different. They made him feel different. The comms officer spoke, snapping the general out of his thoughts. "Sir, the Earth assault preparations are complete. The fleet is ready to begin orbital bombardment on your command." He stared at the officer for a moment, his expression unreadable. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Orbital bombardment. A methodical, efficient annihilation. Millions of lives would be erased in an instant, and the human spirit, the very thing that had stirred something within him, would be extinguished. "Delay the assault," he said suddenly, his voice firm. The officer blinked, clearly surprised. "Sir?" I said delay the assault. I need more time to evaluate the situation. His tone brooked no argument, and the officer reluctantly nodded, issuing the revised command. The general turned and left the control room, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he knew where to find them. The humans had made him question his purpose, but he couldn't resolve that conflict from a distance. He had to see them up close, to understand the fire that burned within them. That night, under the cover of darkness, the general made a decision that would forever change his life. Stripping himself of his rank insignia and abandoning the privileges of command, he boarded a small reconnaissance vessel. Alone, he set a course for Earth. It was an unthinkable act of defiance, but the pull he felt toward the planet was stronger than his fear of consequences. The journey to Earth was quiet, giving him time to reflect. What would he find there? Would the humans welcome him or see him as a monster? He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't continue as he had. He was done with being a pawn in a machine that valued conquest over life, dominance over understanding. The humans had shown him another way, a way he barely dared to hope might still be possible for him. As his vessel entered Earth's atmosphere, alarms blared, warning of potential detection. He ignored them, his focus on the planet below. It was a world scarred by war, but still beautiful, its landscapes vivid with life. He landed in a remote area, far from major cities and military installations, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and vegetation. For the first time in decades, the general felt something other than the weight of command. He felt free, but freedom came with uncertainty, and as he stood there, he realized the enormity of what he had done. He was no longer a general. He was a fugitive, a wanderer on a foreign world, and somewhere out there, the humans he had once sought to destroy would soon discover his presence. How they would react, and whether they would see him as a friend or foe remained to be seen. But whatever happened next, he was ready to face it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from doubt. He was running towards something greater. The stars above him seemed to shine brighter, as if witnessing his choice. And as he took his first steps on Earth, the general felt a spark of something new, a feeling he couldn't quite name but knew would drive him forward. It was hope. The general's boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he walked, his surroundings shrouded in shadows under the cover of night. Each step felt surreal. For so long, he had been surrounded by steel corridors, sterile air, and the unyielding presence of war machines. Now, the softness of the ground, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the distant sounds of life were overwhelming. He adjusted the cloak he had taken from the ship, pulling it tighter around himself to blend in. The vessel was hidden beneath a canopy of thick vegetation, concealed as best as he could manage in his rush to land. It would only be a matter of time before human forces detected its faint energy signature, but he didn't plan to stay near it for long. He had come to Earth for answers, and he wouldn't find them sitting and hiding. In the distance, he saw faint lights flickering, likely a small settlement. Civilization. His heart, or the organ that passed for one in his species, pounded as he considered his next move. He had no plan beyond observation. Approaching humans directly could be dangerous, especially given his appearance. Though humanoid, his features were unmistakably alien, skin a pale, almost metallic hue, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and a tall, imposing frame. To humans, he would look like the enemy they had fought for years. He crouched at the edge of the tree line, scanning the area. The settlement appeared to be a cluster of homes, modest and quiet. Most of the lights were dimmed, but a few still glowed warmly, casting golden light onto the surrounding fields. He could hear faint laughter, the murmur of conversation, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was so ordinary, peaceful, even. The simplicity of it struck him. This was what the humans were fighting to protect, not resources or territory, but their way of life. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen something so untainted by war. On his homeworld, even the concept of such a life had faded into myth. His people had evolved beyond what they deemed primitive emotions and attachments, focusing solely on efficiency and conquest. But as he watched the humans, he couldn't help but feel that his kind had lost something profound. He stayed in the shadows, observing for hours. A woman stepped out onto a porch, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of her home. She held a small child in her arms, rocking gently as she gazed at the stars. Child's soft laughter drifted through the air, pure and unburdened. It was a sound he had never heard among his own people. The general felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Was it regret? Longing? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. This life, these moments, were worth protecting. Yet his fleet, his people were poised to destroy it all. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps nearby. He froze, his senses sharpening. Someone was approaching. He pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, his eyes scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving cautiously but confidently, a human, male, carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder. The general watched as the man paused, scanning the area with practiced precision. He appeared to be a soldier, though not in formal uniform. Perhaps a local militia or someone who had seen enough of the war to know the value of vigilance. The man's gaze swept over the tree line, and for a moment the general thought he had been spotted. But the soldier moved on, his footsteps fading into the night. The encounter left the general uneasy. It was a reminder that while the humans had moments of peace, they were always prepared for conflict. He needed to be careful. His presence here, if discovered, could provoke a violent response, not just from the humans, but also from his own kind, who would see his actions as betrayal. He retreated further into the woods, finding a secluded spot to rest. Sitting against a tree, he let his mind wander. Memories of his life in the fleet surfaced, unbidden. The endless campaigns, the hollow victories, the faces of those he had commanded, and the lives he had extinguished. It all felt so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. What would his crew think if they could see him now? They would call him weak, a traitor to their cause. But he didn't care. He had followed orders his entire life, suppressing every instinct that told him something was wrong. Now, for the first time, he was listening to that voice. As dawn approached, the forest began to stir with life. Birds called out, their songs filling the air, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. The general rose, stretching stiff limbs, and began moving again. He needed to get closer to the humans, to understand them better. But he also needed to be cautious. Hours later, he found himself near the outskirts of the settlement. A dirt road wound through the area, leading to what appeared to be a marketplace. He stayed hidden, observing as people went about their day. Vendors set up stalls, children ran laughing through the streets, and farmers unloaded produce from carts. It was a scene of normalcy, a stark contrast to the war raging in the stars above. He noticed a group of soldiers passing through, their uniforms marked with the insignia of the human alliance. They moved with purpose but stopped occasionally to greet locals, exchanging smiles and casual words. The general was struck by their demeanor. These were warriors, but they carried themselves with a warmth and humanity he had never seen among his own kind. One interaction caught his attention. A soldier knelt to hand a piece of candy to a small child who beamed with delight. The gesture was simple, almost insignificant, but it spoke volumes. These humans didn't fight because they were bred for war. They fought because they believed in something greater than themselves. The general felt a surge of determination. He had to find a way to communicate with them, to warn them of the fleet's impending assault. But how? He couldn't just walk into their midst and expect to be heard. They would see him as a threat, an enemy. He needed to approach carefully, to prove his intentions without alarming them. As he retreated back into the forest to plan his next move, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The fleet would not wait forever. Sooner or later, they would proceed with the assault, and millions of lives would be lost. He had made his choice to defect, to abandon the only life he had ever known. But now came the hardest part, earning the trust of a species that had every reason to hate him. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting its warm light over the settlement, the general vowed to do whatever it took to stop the destruction. He didn't know if he could succeed, but he was willing to risk everything to try. Because for the first time, he understood what it meant to fight for something worth saving. The general moved cautiously through the woods, keeping his senses sharp as the settlement faded into the distance. He needed to think, to figure out a way to bridge the chasm between himself and the humans. Every moment that passed was another tick closer to the fleet's inevitable assault. He imagined the sky above Earth darkening as ships descended, their weapons firing mercilessly, erasing everything he had seen in the last day. The laughter of the children, the warmth of the people, the simple peace of their lives, it would all be gone. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let that happen. But how could he, one being, stop an entire fleet? His people didn't question orders. The fleet would carry out the assault without hesitation, unless someone forced them to stop. He couldn't appeal to their empathy. It was a concept they had long since discarded. No, the only way to stop them was to convince the humans to strike first, to force the fleet to retreat. But that required trust, and trust was something he didn't have. As the day wore on, he wandered deeper into the woods, his mind racing. The sun was beginning to set when he heard voices. He froze, crouching low as the sounds grew closer. A small group of humans emerged from the trees, armed but not in uniform. Their clothing was rugged, and their expressions were wary. They looked like a mix of local militia and civilians, likely patrolling the area for threats. He knew he had to act carefully. He waited until they were close, then stepped out of the shadows, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The humans reacted instantly, their weapons snapping up to aim directly at him. He could see the tension in their faces, the uncertainty mixed with fear. To them, he was the enemy, a member of the species that had brought devastation to their world. "I am not here to harm you," he said, his voice steady but calm. "I need your help." The humans exchanged wary glances, their weapons still trained on him. One of them, a woman with a hardened expression, stepped forward. "You've got 5 seconds to explain why we shouldn't shoot you where you stand." He took a slow breath. This was the moment, the gamble that could decide everything. "Your world is in danger. My people are planning a full-scale assault. They will destroy everything if they are not stopped." The woman narrowed her eyes, clearly skeptical. "Why would we believe anything you say? You're one of them." "I was," he admitted, "but I've seen enough to know this war is wrong. Your people fight for something my kind has forgotten. I cannot stand by and let this happen." Her gaze didn't waver, but he could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "And why should we trust you? This could be a trap." "It's not," he said quickly. "I left everything behind to come here. I've risked my life because I believe your people deserve a chance. If you don't act soon, it will be too late." The silence stretched as the group debated silently among themselves. Finally, the woman lowered her weapon, though the others kept theirs raised. "If you're lying, we'll kill you," she said bluntly. "But if you're telling the truth, we need to get this to someone who can do something about it." He nodded, relief washing over him. "Take me to whoever leads your forces. There's no time to waste." The group escorted him cautiously through the woods, their weapons never fully lowered. He understood their distrust, but hoped he could prove himself before it was too late. As they walked, he explained everything he knew: the fleet's size, their strategy, and the timeline for the assault. The humans listened, their expressions growing darker with each revelation. By the time they reached their destination, night had fallen. The group led him to an underground bunker hidden in the forest, its entrance cleverly camouflaged. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Soldiers and civilians worked side by side, their faces etched with determination and exhaustion. The general could feel their eyes on him as he was brought deeper into the facility. They brought him to a room where a man in a worn but clean uniform sat behind a table, surrounded by maps and holographic displays. He looked up sharply as the group entered, his gaze landing on the general. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone guarded. "This alien," the woman said, gesturing toward the general, "claims to have information about an imminent attack. He says he wants to help us." The man's eyes narrowed as he studied the general. "You've got a lot of nerve walking into our base. Why should we believe a word you say?" The general stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze. "Because I have no reason to lie. I abandoned my people to be here. If I wanted to harm you, I would not have come alone, unarmed." The man leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Talk. Quickly." The general laid out everything he had told the group, his words urgent. He described the fleet's overwhelming power, their plan to strike key targets and cripple Earth's defenses before moving in for the final blow. He spoke of the timeline, stressing how little time they had left to prepare. As he spoke, the room grew quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. When he finished, the man behind the table was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "If what you're saying is true, why are you helping us? What's in it for you?" The general hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've seen what your people are fighting for. Families, communities, a life worth living. My kind has forgotten what that means. I can't change what I've done in the past, but I can try to stop this. That's why I'm here." A man studied him for a long time, then nodded slowly. "If you're lying, it'll be the last mistake you ever make. But if you're telling the truth, we'll need every piece of information you have to stop this." The general felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. They had a chance, but the clock was ticking, and the fleet would not wait. As the humans began to mobilize, he realized that the hardest part was yet to come. The fleet was closing in, and the battle for Earth was about to begin. The general stood at the center of the room, surrounded by holographic projections of Earth and the fleet's known positions. The humans worked quickly, coordinating defenses and relaying his information to their superiors. Though he had given them everything he knew, the tension in the room was palpable. Time was slipping away, and every second brought the fleet closer to Earth. He watched as the commanding officer, a man the others referred to simply as Colonel, gave rapid orders to his team. There was no hesitation in his voice, only sharp precision, like someone who had spent years fighting impossible odds. The general respected that. In another life, the colonel might have been a rival, someone he would have admired even as an adversary. Now, they were allies, tenuous as that alliance might be. Then the first report came in. A scout ship on the edge of Earth's atmosphere had picked up an unusual signal and encrypted transmission, not originating from the fleet, but from within Earth's orbit. The room went quiet as the technician explained. It wasn't just any signal. It was a broadcast in the language of the general's people. For a moment, he felt his breath catch. What could it mean? The colonel turned to him, his eyes sharp. What are they doing? Is this part of the attack? The general shook his head, genuinely confused. No, this isn't standard protocol. A transmission like this, it could be a warning or a diversion, but it doesn't align with the fleet's usual tactics. The room erupted into speculation, but the colonel silenced them with a raised hand. Can you decode it? He asked the general. The general hesitated, then nodded. If you give me access to the signal, I can try. The technicians worked quickly, patching the signal through to a secured console. The general leaned over the terminal, his hands moving swiftly as he translated the message. The room watched in tense silence, the only sound the hum of machinery and the faint tapping of his fingers on the keys. Finally, the translation appeared on the screen.
His heart sank as he read it.
The message was simple, but devastating. Secondary directive activated. Advance infiltration units operational. Proceed with caution. He turned to the humans, his voice grave. This isn't just an attack. They've already deployed agents on your planet. Infiltrators designed to weaken your defenses from within. The colonel's expression hardened. How many? Where are they? The general shook his head. I don't know. The message doesn't say, but these units are highly specialized. They'll blend in, target critical infrastructure, and sow chaos before the main assault. The room exploded into chaos as the implications sank in. The humans had been preparing for a direct assault, but this changed everything. If the infiltrators succeeded, the fleet wouldn't even need to destroy Earth. It would collapse on its own. The colonel called for immediate lockdowns and increased security across all critical locations. Every base, every communication hub, every resource depot was put on high alert. The general could see the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. They were fighting a war on two fronts now, one in the skies and one hidden among their own. As the humans scrambled to adapt, the general's mind raced. This tactic wasn't just ruthless, it was personal. The infiltrators weren't sent to weaken Earth's defenses. They were sent to undermine his credibility. The fleet didn't need to deploy them to win. They had done it to ensure that if he defected, his actions would be futile. His people had anticipated his betrayal. A chilling thought struck him. What if they were watching him now? What if the infiltrators' first mission wasn't to sabotage the humans, but to neutralize him? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted, even here, among those who were starting to trust him. That's when the alarms blared. The red lights flooded the room as an automated voice announced a breach in one of the outer perimeters. The colonel's hand went to his weapon, and everyone sprang into action. The general stepped back, his instincts sharpening. "Stay here," the colonel barked at him before turning to his team. "Seal the bunker and secure the entrances. I want every exit monitored." The general nodded, but knew he couldn't stay idle. If the infiltrators had already found their way here, they would stop at nothing to complete their mission. And he has sinking suspicion that mission involved him. Minutes later, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the corridors. The general moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as soldiers rushed past him. His mind raced as he tried to predict the infiltrators' strategy. They wouldn't attack head-on. That wasn't their way. They would create diversions, divide attention, and strike where it hurt the most. As he moved deeper into the bunker, his suspicions were confirmed. A figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. It was one of his own, a soldier from the fleet, their uniform modified to blend with Earth's environment. Their eyes glowed faintly, just like his, and their expression was cold and unyielding. "General," the infiltrator said, their voice flat, "you've caused quite a mess." He stared at them, his muscles tensing. "You're here to stop me." "I'm here to correct your mistake," they replied. "You've forgotten who you are, letting these creatures cloud your judgment. It's pathetic." "I haven't forgotten," he said firmly. "That's why I'm here, to stop the destruction." The infiltrator tilted their head, almost mockingly. "You think you can save them? You can't even save yourself." Before he could respond, the infiltrator lunged, moving with inhuman speed. The general barely dodged in time, his instincts kicking in as he countered the attack. The corridor became a blur of motion as the two clashed, their strikes quick and brutal. The infiltrator fought with precision, every move designed to incapacitate or kill. But the general had something they didn't resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the humans, for everything he had seen in the last day. With a final surge of strength, he disarmed the infiltrator, sending their weapon clattering to the ground. The infiltrator sneered, blood trickling from their lip. "You're a fool, General. They'll never trust you. And even if they do, it won't matter. The fleet will come, and this world will burn." He looked down at them, his expression resolute. "Not if I stop it." The infiltrators smirked, then activated a device on their wrist. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air, and the infiltrator's body stiffened before collapsing. It was a failsafe, a way to ensure they couldn't be captured. But their words lingered, heavy in the air. The general knew the infiltrator wasn't the only one. There would be others, more shadows lurking among the humans. And now, the humans had even more reason to doubt him. He had stopped one threat, but the war was far from over. The clock was still ticking, and the fleet was still coming. The general stood over the lifeless body of the infiltrator, his mind spinning. He didn't have time to process what had just happened. The infiltrator's death was a small victory, but it was hollow. There were more out there, and the humans still didn't fully trust him. If he didn't act fast, everything he had risked would be for nothing. He grabbed the device from the infiltrator's wrist and examined it. It was heavily encrypted, but he recognized the design a beacon, likely broadcasting the infiltrator's last location to the fleet. The bunker was now a target. He turned and sprinted back toward the command room, weaving through the narrow corridors. The alarms were still blaring, and the tension in the air was suffocating. When he burst into the room, the colonel was already issuing orders. The other humans froze for a moment, their eyes locking onto the general, but the colonel waved them off. "What happened?" the colonel demanded. "There was an infiltrator," the general said, holding up the beacon. They're tracking this location. Your position is compromised. Colonel swore under his breath, then turned to his team. Evacuate immediately. All personnel to fallback positions. Chaos erupted as the bunker came alive with movement. Soldiers grabbed gear, civilians were rushed out, and communication systems crackled with updates. The general followed the colonel to a secure console where a map displayed the fleet's positions. They'll be here soon, the colonel muttered. We won't have time to regroup before they hit us. The general stared at the map, his mind racing. The humans were brave, resourceful, but their defenses were stretched thin. A direct assault would be catastrophic. Then an idea struck him, a desperate, reckless plan. He turned to the colonel, his voice steady but urgent. I can stop them. The colonel gave him a skeptical look. How? They're tracking this, the general said, holding up the beacon. If I take it and lead them away, they'll follow. It'll buy you time to regroup, to mount a proper defense. The colonel hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. And what happens when they catch you? The general's gaze didn't waver. Then I make sure they can't follow. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Colonel studied him for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod. If this is a trick. It's not, the general said firmly. I came here to help. Let me do this. Within minutes, the plan was set. The general took the beacon and left the bunker, moving quickly through the forest. The humans had given him a vehicle, an old but reliable transport that could outrun most ground units. He activated the beacon, ensuring the fleet would lock onto its signal, then sped away from the bunker, heading toward the most desolate area he could find. The night was dark and quiet, the only sound the hum of the transport's engine. As he drove, he couldn't help but think about the choices that had led him here. He had been a soldier, loyal to his people, unquestioning in his duty. Now he was a traitor, risking everything for a world that wasn't his own. But he didn't regret it. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was fighting for something real. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of engines overhead. He looked up to see the fleet's ships closing in, their lights cutting through the darkness. They had taken the bait. He pushed the transport to its limits, weaving through the rough terrain as the ships fired warning shots around him. They wanted him alive for now. Finally, he reached his destination, a barren wasteland far from any human settlements. He skidded to a stop and stepped out of the transport, the beacon in hand. The ships circled overhead, their engines roaring. He knew what would come next. They would land, capture him, and use him as leverage against the humans. He couldn't let that happen. Taking a deep breath, he activated the beacon's failsafe. It would emit a massive pulse, temporarily scrambling the fleet's communications and leaving their ground forces vulnerable. But it would also reveal his position completely, ensuring there would be no escape for him. He set the timer and placed the beacon on the ground, then stepped back, watching as the ships began to descend. As the timer ticked down, he prepared himself for the end. But then, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned, and his heart sank. Another infiltrator was approaching, their weapon drawn. He hadn't expected them to find him so quickly. The infiltrator smirked, their voice dripping with contempt. Did you really think you could outsmart us, General? You've always been predictable. He didn't respond, instead lunging forward to close the distance. The two clashed, their movements fast and brutal. The infiltrator fought with precision, but the general fought with desperation. He couldn't let them disable the beacon, not when everything depended on it. The fight was fierce, but the general managed to overpower the infiltrator, slamming them to the ground. They sneered up at him, their voice cold. "It doesn't matter what you do. The fleet will destroy this planet, with or without you." The general didn't hesitate. "Not if I stop it." The beacon's timer reached 0. A blinding pulse of energy erupted from the device, lighting up the night sky. The infiltrator screamed as the pulse disrupted their systems, leaving them stunned. Above, the fleet's ships faltered, their formations breaking as their communications were severed. The general didn't wait to see what would happen next. He climbed back into the transport and sped away, knowing the humans would use this moment to strike. They had a chance now, slim but real, and for the first time, he felt hope. But as he drove, a strange feeling washed over him. Something wasn't right. He glanced at the transport's console and saw a faint signal, a secondary beacon hidden in the vehicle, transmitting his location to the fleet. The infiltrator had planted it during their fight. His heart sank as he realized the truth. He hadn't led the fleet away from the humans. He had led them directly to the fallback position. The realization hit him like a physical blow, but there was no time to dwell on it. His mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. The fleet was already closing in, and the humans at the fallback position had no idea they were walking into a trap. He gripped the transport's controls tightly, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had to fix this, no matter the cost. He veered the vehicle off course, heading toward a dense mountain range. If he could keep the fleet focused on him for just a little longer, the humans might have enough time to prepare. The terrain grew rougher as he climbed higher, the transport struggling against the steep incline. He could feel the ship's sensors tracking his every move, their presence a constant pressure. They weren't letting him go, and he couldn't let them. As he approached a narrow pass, an idea formed in his mind. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it was the only chance he had to stop the fleet. He pulled the transport to a halt and stepped out, leaving the engine running. The beacon was still transmitting, drawing the ships closer. He set the vehicle to autopilot and programmed it to continue through the pass at full speed. Then he climbed a rocky outcrop, positioning himself where he could see the fleet's advance. The first ship appeared moments later, its sleek metallic hull reflecting the moonlight. It hovered briefly before descending into the pass, following the transport signal. The general waited, his heart pounding. More ships followed, their engines echoing through the mountains. Once the last ship entered the pass, he activated the remote detonator he had taken from the infiltrator earlier. Explosives hidden in the transport's cargo hold detonated, sending a massive shockwave through the narrow canyon. The pass collapsed in a cascade of rocks, trapping the ships inside. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then a few scattered explosions as the trapped ships tried to escape. The general knew it wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy the humans precious time. He climbed down from his perch, his body aching from the strain of the fight and the climb. The beacon had been destroyed in the blast, and for the first time in hours, he felt a sliver of relief. But he wasn't done yet. The infiltrators were still out there, and the fleet would regroup. He had to get back to the humans, warn them, and help them prepare for what was coming. He began the long trek back, his body protesting every step. The landscape around him was barren and unforgiving, the cold biting through his uniform. But he pressed on, driven by a determination he hadn't felt in years. When he finally reached the humans' fallback position, he was greeted with wary looks and raised weapons. The colonel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The general raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "They're coming," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I've slowed them down." You have time to prepare." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We've already started fortifying. What do you need?" The general hesitated. These humans had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe he wasn't leading them into another trap. But they had listened. They had acted. For the first time, he felt like he was truly part of their fight. "We need to focus on the infiltrators," he said finally. "They'll strike before the fleet does, targeting your key defenses. We need to find them and stop them." The humans sprang into action, organizing search teams and increasing security. The general worked alongside them, using his knowledge of the fleet's tactics to anticipate the infiltrators' moves. Slowly, they began to uncover signs of sabotage, disrupted communications, tampered equipment, even disguised infiltrators hiding among their ranks. Each discovery brought a small victory, but the general knew the real battle was yet to come. The night dragged on, the air thick with tension. As dawn approached, the general stood with the colonel on a ridge overlooking their defenses. The humans had done everything they could, but the fleet was vast, their technology advanced. The general could see the doubt in the colonel's eyes, the fear that it wouldn't be enough. "They'll underestimate you," the general said quietly. "They always do. That's their weakness." The colonel turned to him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And you?" The general met his gaze. "I've stopped underestimating you." When the fleet finally arrived, the humans were ready. The battle was fierce, the sky filled with fire and smoke as the two sides clashed. The infiltrators launched their attacks, but the humans countered them with precision and resolve. The general fought alongside them, his presence a rallying point for those around him. He moved with purpose, his every action a defiance of the fleet that had once commanded his loyalty. As the hours wore on, it became clear that the humans were holding their ground. The fleet's ships faltered, their formations breaking under the relentless assault. The general watched as the tide began to turn, a surge of pride and relief washing over him. For the first time, he believed they could win. In the final moments of the battle, the general faced the fleet's commander, a figure he had once served under, their authority absolute. The commander's voice was cold and sharp as they accused him of betrayal, of abandoning his duty. But the general stood firm, his voice steady as he spoke. "My duty is to protect life," he said. "And I found more worth protecting here than I ever did with you." The commander sneered, but their words were drowned out by the humans' victory. The fleet's forces retreated, their ships disappearing into the void. The battle was over, but the general knew the war wasn't. The fleet would regroup, and the humans would need to remain vigilant. As the dust settled, the general stood among the humans, his heart heavy but hopeful. They had fought together, bled together, and won together. They had trusted him, despite everything, and he had earned that trust. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. The colonel approached him, a faint smile on his face. "Not bad for a defector." The general allowed himself a small smile in return. "Not bad for humans." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the battle hanging in the air. Then, the colonel extended a hand. The general hesitated, then took it, the gesture simple but profound. "You're one of us now," the colonel said. The general nodded, his resolve firm. "Then let's make sure they never forget it." Together, they turned to face the horizon, ready to build a future worth fighting for.